Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Today we enter a difficult conversation, and we're going to be making a link between sexual abuse and spiritual abuse. And for many who have endured sexual abuse, to bring in the category of spiritual abuse is not a common category. And for many who have been spiritually abused, bringing in sexual abuse is not often done. So we're aware that we're going to be asking a great deal of you as a listener. And for those of you who would say, I don't have any clear spiritual abuse or sexual abuse, let me just promise you, if you've got more than 4 friends, you have good friends who have endured both spiritual abuse and sexual abuse. So as we step into this, Rachael, we're in difficult water.
We are, and that's why it's going to be really important for anyone listening, ourselves included, to just tend wisely and kindly to your body in this season. So if this is material that you think, you know what, this is a little too close to home, I think I'll come back and revisit this at another time, then know that this is a podcast. We're going to record it. It will be there for you when you're ready. And another thing I would just say is these are also very large, vast categories, and we're not going to have time into kind of 30-minute conversations to address with nuance well places we'd actually love to address well. So it is our hope that this would be an ongoing conversation that can expand over time. And I will just say for myself, when we're talking about spiritual abuse on this podcast, we are coming from a Christian orientation and likely some spaces that are, I just am aware when you're talking about sexual abuse and spiritual abuse, there is a lot of good material out there right now. And that is really good because there are entire communities, collective communities of people who could say, I have experienced sexual abuse that is spiritually abusive. And there are people who can say, I've experienced spiritual abuse that is sexually abusive. And so we won't be able to tell everyone's story. And so I would also say, as you're listening, if there's more you want to hear or resources that you think would be good for us to be listening to, we hope that you'll always feel freedom to engage with us.
You know, Rachael, as we step in after truly a sweet and kind pastoral moment, we're underscoring that all sexual abuse, we'll talk a little bit about the nature of sexual abuse, but we're really saying all sexual abuse is spiritual abuse. And not all spiritual abuse involves direct, clear sexual abuse. So that's part of the nuance here that is important to underscore. And in that, what we're going to be asking you to at least consider is the relationship between the two. Yes, there are differences, but there is a kind of power that is there with regard to both. In one sense, any form of supremacy that rules over the body and has the authority to, in some sense, describe, prescribe, or conscribe, it ends up having the high probability of some form of violation. That category was made deeply clear by our dear friend and colleague, Linda Royster, who brought, at least to me, many years ago, the reality that all white supremacy, in that sense, all supremacy, all power that does not serve for human flourishing, for the interplay of justice and mercy, inevitably will misuse and in that misuse will violate in some form of violence. And so it's one of these categories that, as you hear, absolute power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts in a way that steals something of innocence. It devours, and in some sense punishes. So we're right back to two key categories. All violation is the interplay of lust and anger, or adultery and murder. So if you can hold that as a beginning point, what we're talking about ultimately is sin in the form of authority, where someone uses and then violates. And that describes the reality of both spiritual abuse, but also sexual abuse.
Well, and when I'm thinking about the link between sexual abuse and spiritual abuse, there is a lot of linkage between these two realities, because you said this, any form of abuse in general always has some element of spiritual abuse, because abuse is a violation of our personhood and our capacity to give and receive love, and to have dignity, and to, believe that we're made in the image of God. And that is one of our inheritances, that we are people who are made in the image of God, and not just in ourselves as an individual, but in our connection and our capacity for union and play and co-creation with others. So anytime there is a violation of the, being an image bearer. So in some ways, that's when you talk about supremacy. Supremacy is at its very base a violation of the dignity and truth of being an image bearer, one made in the image of the triune God. And so when we think about that spiritual harm, that severing of our personhood, whether it's coming through sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, something that causes us to turn our face away, something that causes us to distrust and actually find disgust in our own body. And it's hard because we hear this word spiritual and it's often so divorced from our sense of the body. But the body is the primary playground we've been given to actually be spiritual beings. And again, back to that sense of being image bearers, as ones who bear the glory of God in our capacity to be in relationship with others, in relationship in our communities, and ultimately, like you said, building towards flourishing. And we know that spiritual abuse exists on a spectrum, right? That there's a reality of spiritual abuse that can be very explicit. You have a direct authority figure in spiritual authority who is misusing their power at its most basic sense. They are misusing their power to control, to coerce, to manipulate. And again, so many of the processes of grooming, which we'll talk more about in a moment, with spiritual abuse are very similar to the processes of grooming with sexual abuse. And when those two realities merge, when the perpetrator of sexual abuse is actually literally a spiritual authority, a pastor, a mentor, a parachurch ministry leader, a teacher at a school that is coming out of a kind of theological imagination or biblical imagination, the harm and the severing that comes is so diabolical, because it's not only maybe this threat of a severing from relationship in the physical, it is a threat of a severing of relationship with God. So we're in these really, where there is that touch point, it's very diabolical.
Oh, even talking about it, I find myself wanting to shake, because that intersection is such a shattering of trust between two human beings. But when you bring the reality of the face that is engaging you bears some sense of authorization from God. So there is another being God involved in that process. That became clear to me early on when I was working with an abused woman who told me that her abuser, after one horrendous experience of abuse, said to her, "I will never leave you. You will always remember me, always." And the chill, I mean, this is decades ago, these words were spoken, but it became obviously clear this evil perpetrator understood something of Christ's words of, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And that abuser was putting himself in the position of saying, every time, essentially, you are sexual, every time your body has any degree of pleasure, you will remember me. I will be with you always. That sense of, I will have power over your life forever, I think is, again, the reality for all abusers. But in this case, this man actually was articulate with that desire to shroud her life and consume her pleasure for the remainder of her life. And that it's where you just have to step back and say, as you said, well, Rachel, this is diabolic. Even if the person is not consciously serving evil, there is no question that person is wanting to make sure you are bound to them for the rest of your life. I think it's so important, Rachel, that we be clear that sexual abuse may not involve physical touch. So whenever a person with power, and that can be just a child your own age yet, who has much more knowledge and intentionality, uses you for their sexual pleasure, whether it's through touch or visually or verbally, that is a violation of your dignity, as you put brilliantly, a violation of your body, which is the very temple of God. So in that sense, sexual abuse is a unique violation, but it bears so much similarity to the realm of spiritual abuse.
And when we talk about spiritual abuse, again, it's really, I know it could be confusing because we're talking about a very specific kind of abuse that is utilizing given spiritual authority that we as people often lend our leaders, whether that's good or bad or wise, that's a conversation for another day. But when someone in spiritual authority, or even a spiritually authoritative concept, gets utilized to wield power in an abusive way, and that abuse, again, can involve extreme examples where we see people in what we would think of as a cult, where there are very rigid boundaries of who's in and who's out. But that spiritual abuse can also play out with bad theology that's being used to control or exploit fear, or to use shame as a weapon of control. So we can look at, some of these movements, like the purity movement of the early 90s. I think the church's posture and treatment of the LGBTQ plus community with regard, anytime there is when fear and shame are used as tools to isolate, to violate, to divide, we are in the realm of spiritual abuse. And those are areas where we're in the realm of where spiritual abuse is directly connected to sexuality, and is in a really, I think, dangerous and violating playground. And so spiritual abuse exists on a spectrum, but it's those places where your own autonomy, your body, there's always a direct assault on the body in spiritual abuse. It's one of the primary tools that's being used. Your body is deceitful. You can't trust it. It's not, you need my authority. God is disgusted with your body. It's a cutting off of wisdom ultimately. It's a cutting off of wisdom and a lie to say, my wisdom is better and more godly, and will give you more access to God. And so I always think of, for me, like some ways, my simple definition of spiritual abuse is just when someone actually thinks they have the power to tell you if and when you are outside of the love of God. It's like ultimately a posture of spiritual abuse and lacks profound wisdom and humility.
And that's a profound and crucial definition. And the only thing I would add is I see it as a conquest of the other through contempt. And anytime, irrespective of what I believe about X, Y, or Z, within a doctrinal range of understanding, whenever I treat another human being with contempt, that will violate their human dignity in a way that hardly anything else will do. Ultimately, the abuser sexually, the abuser spiritually, is using the power of their body to control, but in that control, it isn't just control so they get what they want. There's something about that impulse to not just conquest, but to kill, to demean, to degrade, and ultimately, in that sense, to bring contempt against the other. So important to step back and say, how often does spiritual abuse occur in communities where, at least at first, things look well? Mm-hmm. There's a grooming process. Mm-hmm. You brought that up earlier. Mm-hmm. There's an actual process, generally speaking, for both sexual abuse and spiritual abuse. And how would you describe that?
Well, I mean, grooming is... honestly, I hate talking about grooming. It makes me so mad because it mirrors what we're meant for. It is a misuse of attunement that we're meant for, of being read well, of our needs being anticipated, of being seen in ways we long to be seen and invited to belonging, that our hearts long for. So I think there is grooming, whether it's in a primary sexually abusive way or a primary spiritually abusive way, is always going to involve some invitation to belonging, invitation to care, invitation to connection, that ultimately we're made for, but in our own wounding may not see it as being exploited by someone who knows, if they offer good care or they offer an invitation to safety or belonging, then something in us is going to be like, yes, I want that. So you see that, obviously, I mean, when we talk about some pretty kind of textbook spiritual abusers, you've got a lot of people who are in leadership positions who work with kids, teachers, scout leaders, pastors, camp counselors, parents, uncles, aunts, however you want to talk about it. And no, there's, as you named, like also peers. But these are people who are already in positions of authority, who are supposed to read children well, supposed to read people well.
Well, and again, let me add therapists to that list. And as we, in one sense, what we're talking about is often that individual who sets you up. And it's an important phrase. Grooming is a setup. It is a form. I don't know a better word than the word seduction, but it is not primarily spiritual or sexual, but it is a use of care and kindness and attunement to draw you into the net. So by the time you are in the web, there has been so much goodness that you have taken in. And in that goodness, your body, your heart, your joy has had some level of rise. And therefore, you're in some sense now in the bonds that will become bondage. And in that bondage, what I find is that the next stage of this grooming is I bind you to me uniquely. Like there's something very special about you and me. And in that very special relationship, sometimes secrets, sometimes struggles are shared. There is a hold we have together that binds us. And you're not like anyone else. You bear a wisdom, a goodness. And so every one of us wants to not only be seen, but deeply valued and enjoyed. And this is where oftentimes there will be statements about, you are so beautiful. There's nobody like you. There's no soul like you. So that specialness eventually comes to be the basis by which we look back and say, how could I have been such a fool? How could I have been so stupid? And you can already hear the sense of complicity and blame that begins to rise, because connection begins to open the door to a level of comfort that then gets taken to control. And that is, you can't do X, you need to do Y. And so there will be a setting of parameters about what is acceptable and what is not. And often that may feel constrictive, but for many of us, it feels like, oh, someone's providing me with clarity about how to live well. And so even then, scripture gets used as the guardrails as to don't do this, but do this. And this is where it's so hard to take apart. Sometimes the guardrails are really true. But they're being offered as a truth to control, not a truth to actually create human flourishing. But it's almost impossible at the early stages to see the intentionality of that person, because so much is already so well.
Well, and I think you're tapping into that reality where there's complicity and blame. There's so much shame. And shame is such an effective tool of isolation and control, because it's one of the most unbearable, I think, human experiences. When we feel humiliation and shame, it's almost that feeling of, I'm so bad, I'm so disgusting, there will be no love for me, there will be no welcome, there will be no goodness for me. I wish I could fall into this hole and disappear. It is, in some ways, a desire to cease to exist. At its core, that feeling of I don't want to be here. And the shame that we are bound to when sexual abuse happens is so profound, right? It's that sense of, if you tell anyone about this, your parents won't love you. If you tell anyone about this, or the threat of further violence or further violation. But I think when there's a spiritually abusive element to it, it's God won't love you. You'll be exiled from this whole community. And not only will you be exiled, you'll be scapegoated. You see what happens to people who sin, to sinners in this community. They bear the rage. They bear the contempt. They bear the exile. And so there's an added layer of isolation and shame. And when we're talking about spiritual abuse that's playing out in a community, there's also often an invitation to join in the perpetration of whether it's explicitly or implicitly, to kind of bring similar ideas and control and manipulation to others so that you can stay in belonging. So it's a very powerful fusion in the ways that it fragments, that it brings fragmentation of our brains, our bodies, our arousal structures, our relationships, but I think primarily our capacity to imagine and experience a relationship with God.
Well, and to underscore that, to say, your body is having to shut down, because as the abuse continues, the greater the control, the greater the contempt, something in your body knows there's violation. Yet, if you know that, you lose all the benefits of what the perpetrator has offered. So, in that sense, it's part of the blame. You see, I wanted his care, her care. I wanted that attunement. And then when it's actual sexual touch, one's body actually feels some degree of arousal and pleasure. So with all that, it becomes the judgment base that in some ways the abuser and ultimately the ultimate abuser, evil, is attempting to accomplish, that you join in the assault of your own self and body so that you create now, in one sense, a spiritual abuse of yourself, a sexual abuse of yourself. And that's just crazy making. I mean, even saying it, the body shuts down, but is more aroused. One feels more connected, yet more disconnected. And in all that fragmentation, what often happens is there is no one you can trust. So if it's a pastoral figure, who are you going to tell? If it's a therapist, who will believe you? And not only believe you, but actually help you begin to move toward any level of care, of being able to address the harm, and to be able to find both justice and mercy for your own body. So I think what we're saying is the brilliance of both the interplay, dark brilliance of the interplay of sexual abuse and spiritual abuse, it turns you against your ability to trust God. It turns you against your own ability to trust your body and yourself. And in that, you are so isolated that literally this kind of harm can perpetuate over long periods of time, which only adds more blame. So before we end, and we will come back to address what are the steps, even though we don't believe in methodology of steps, what's the process by which a person can begin to address this? But I don't think we can end without, in one sense, saying we believe that the courageous, difficult work of owning I don't trust, being able to even name that, is a form of trust. It's a form of acknowledgement of what your body and heart and spirit have endured, and to be able to begin to step away and to bear some of that loss and isolation begins a process that we will try and walk you through when we return.
And I would also say that we believe that the living God is not bound to all the false images of God that so many of us have been given, especially by those in spiritual leadership and authority in our midst. And so we do believe that the gracious and wild and so kind God, who honors our personhood, because God created our personhood, delights in our personhood, will be at work, is at work, has been at work, and will continue to be at work on all of our behalf.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.